So I have always believed that experience is not just a resume line. It is a map of all the storms you have already navigated. My name is Dana Lewis. I am 41 years old, and I have spent nearly 20 years in the high-stakes world of corporate compliance. Ridgewell Capital Partners in Boston had been my professional home for most of my adult life. I grew up in a small town in Vermont where people still shook hands on a deal and meant it, and maybe that is why I was drawn to compliance. Because it is about keeping promises on paper and protecting people from costly mistakes. Over the years, I had survived 3 CEOs, 2 recessions, and a merger that nearly split the company apart. I had done it without ever missing a deadline, without a single write-up, and without losing the company 1 cent in penalties. My desk was my anchor, my binders my compass, and my quiet, methodical approach my shield. It was a cold spring morning when the ripple in my calm began. I remember sitting in the corner of the conference room with a coffee gone lukewarm, reviewing a high-risk transaction file. Through the glass walls, I saw him before I even knew his name. A tall, lean man in his early 30s, striding down the hallway like he had been born to own it. He wore tailored slacks and sneakers so white they practically glowed under the fluorescent lights. His jacket was unbuttoned, his hair styled just enough to look carelessly perfect, and when he stepped into the room, the air shifted. He introduced himself with that confident ease you only see in people who have never had to clean up a mess of their own making. Tyler Grant, 33 years old, straight from a tech firm in California, hired as our new vice president of operations. From the moment he opened his mouth, I could feel his certainty pressing against the walls like heat. Disruption, he said, is our lifeblood. He spoke about speed, about streamlining, about eliminating what he called legacy baggage so the company could move forward faster. When I listened, nodding politely, though inside I was already measuring the gap between his ideas and the reality I had lived for nearly 2 decades. Compliance is not about speed. It is about precision. Yet the difference between the two can be $40 million lost or saved. But Tyler did not see that. To him, my wall of binders was not a vault of hard-earned wisdom. It was an eyesore. He made his opinion known quickly. "These Stone Age artifacts," he said one afternoon as he passed my desk, gesturing at the carefully labeled shelves, "must be a nightmare to dig through. Wise, we should get rid of them before they grow cobwebs." I looked up at him, measuring whether he was joking. He was not. His tone was light, but there was a certainty underneath it, the kind that does not invite disagreement. I felt a slow burn in my chest. Those binders were my life's work. Each page represented a problem solved, a loophole closed, a disaster prevented. They were my fingerprints all over the company's survival. In that moment, I realized Tyler and I spoke different languages entirely. Mispati saw the company as a sleek machine that could be optimized with a few keystrokes and a cloud server, while I saw it as a living organism that had weathered storms and carried scars you could only understand if you had been there when they were made. And he talked about replacing outdated systems without once asking what those systems had saved us from. It was not just arrogance. It was blindness. And blindness in compliance is a dangerous thing. I wish I could say I fought back then and there, but I have learned that some battles are not worth fighting in the open. I watched him charm the board with his slides, watched the younger staff lean in with wide eyes as he promised them a future free of administrative drag. I smiled when spoken to, kept my tone measured, but inside I felt that old, familiar tightening in my gut. The one that told me I was watching a man dismantle something he did not understand. And I also knew something else. People like Tyler do not learn from warnings. They learn from consequences. That was the first day I understood my time at Ridgewell was ending. Not because I had failed, but because my kind of work was not valued anymore. At least, not by the one now holding the reins. But endings can be beginnings in disguise. And while Tyler was busy imagining his shiny new future, I was already considering what would be left behind when his vision ran headfirst into reality. I did not know exactly how it would happen yet, but I knew this much. My binders were not going anywhere without me deciding their fate. Mo, and one in particular, would end up teaching him the lesson he did not know he needed. There is a strange calm that comes when you know a chapter of your life is closing. It is not panic. It is not even sadness. It is a kind of stillness, like the air just before a storm breaks. In the weeks after Tyler's arrival, I went about my work with the same steady rhythm I always had, filing reports, answering questions, signing off on transactions. Outwardly, nothing about me had changed. But inside, I had already accepted that my days at Ridgewell were numbered. I could see the writing on the wall. Or rather, I could hear it in Tyler's voice each time he used words like eliminate and replace while looking in my direction. When you spend almost 20 years in the same place, you learn every corner, every quirk of the building. The basement archives had always been my sanctuary. A dim, climate-controlled space lined with shelves of history. It smelled faintly of paper and ink, a smell I found comforting in a way no digital system could match. Most employees avoided it, finding it too quiet, too old-fashioned, too far from the buzz of the main floor. For me, that was exactly why I loved it. If the upper floors were all light and glass and ego, the archives were stone and memory. One Wednesday morning, I walked down there with a purpose that I kept hidden behind a neutral face. When my shoes echoed against the concrete floor as I moved past rows of labeled binders, each one a snapshot of a different era in the company's life. I stopped in front of a section marked Legacy Clients. My fingers skimmed the spines until I found it. A thick, red binder with the label I had printed myself in bold black letters. Legacy Clients. Do not purge. Inside was a history that no one upstairs could piece together without me. It was not just contracts. It was notes and margins, handwritten alerts, cross-referenced clauses, and my own assessments from situations long past but not forgotten. I pulled it from the shelf and wiped a thin layer of dust from the cover. I thought of the meetings I had been in, the tense phone calls, the last-minute saves this binder had made possible. Without it, certain deals would look perfectly safe when they were anything but. That was the danger Tyler did not understand. History is not just old paperwork. It is a record of the fires you have already put out, and without it, you do not see the smoke until you are choking on it. I walked deeper into the archives and found a shelf far in the back, behind boxes of outdated training manuals no one had touched in years. I slid the binder into place, angled just enough that it would not be visible unless you were looking for it. Then I stepped back, hands resting on the edge of the shelf for a moment, and let out a slow breath. I was not stealing it. I was not destroying it. I was simply preserving it. Somewhere safe, away from the eager hands of someone who believed nothing before his arrival was worth keeping. For the rest of that day, I carried on as if nothing had happened. I answered Tyler's questions politely, signed off on reports, and even managed a smile when he announced his latest plan for total digitization in the next quarter. I nodded like it was a fine idea. Inside, I knew the truth. When the cracks in his perfect system started to show, the missing piece would be waiting. Quietly, patiently, just like me, Run, by the time Friday came, I had cleared my desk of personal items, taken down the small framed photo of my parents, and packed the few books I kept nearby. No drama. Just no scene. I was leaving on my own terms, and with the one thing I knew they would need more than they realized. If Tyler's reign was going to be about speed, then mine would be about time. Time that would prove exactly how dangerous it is to erase the past. The Monday after I handed in my resignation, Tyler began moving at a pace that would have impressed anyone who did not understand the cost of speed. From my seat on the sidelines, still wrapping up my final 2 weeks, I watched him with the detached calm of someone who has already decided to walk away. He called back-to-back meetings, introduced a new project management platform with flashy dashboards, and announced that full operational optimization would be complete within 6 months. The phrase made some of the younger analysts sit up straighter, their eyes lit with the excitement of being part of something bold. But for those of us who had been here long enough to remember the near disasters of the past, it sounded more like the drumbeat of an oncoming march into the unknown. Tyler wasted no time dismantling the systems I had spent years fine-tuning. The physical archives, which had taken decades to build and preserve, were at the top of his list. If it is not in the cloud, it is not worth keeping, he declared during a meeting, his voice carrying the weight of someone who believed he was speaking an unshakable truth. There was no room for discussion. The older managers exchanged glances, some of them clearly biting back questions. I simply sat quietly, my hands folded on the table, because I knew that debating with someone who had already decided the answer was like shouting into the wind. He replaced the compliance review process with a faster, automated screening system. It looked impressive on paper. Instant red flags, predictive analytics, and automated alerts that pinged your inbox in seconds. But the system only knew what it had been programmed to know. It could not recall that in 2007 we had nearly lost an 8-figure deal over an obscure clause buried in an unrelated section of a contract. It could not remember the calls I had taken late at night, walking a panicked client through a sudden regulatory shift in a foreign market. It could not see the gray areas where human judgment mattered more than any algorithm. In one meeting, I overheard him telling a junior analyst, "We are not in the business of babysitting deals from 10 years ago." That is dead weight. I felt the sting of the words more than I cared to admit. He was talking about my work, my history, and the safeguards that had kept this company from bleeding money more times than they realized. But again, I said nothing. There is a particular satisfaction in letting someone believe they have erased your footprint when you know it is still there, hidden, waiting for the right moment. By the end of the first month, Tyler's vision was in full swing. Shelves in the archives were being emptied, scanned, and then shredded. The buzz of the shredding machines became part of the daily soundtrack. Analysts who had once relied on my binders now walked around with tablets, tapping at screens with forced enthusiasm. Tyler walked the floors like a victorious general, soaking in the applause of his supporters. Unto the untrained eye, it looked like progress. And to me, it looked like the careful removal of the company's safety net. I kept my thoughts to myself as I finished my final projects, signing off on a handful of deals I had already reviewed months earlier. Every time I walked past the archive room, now half empty, I felt a small, steady comfort. Now the red binder sat untouched, tucked away behind boxes that no one had the patience to sort through. He could purge the visible history all he wanted. What he could not touch was what he did not know existed. And in compliance, what you do not know will always be the thing that comes back to cost you. It started as a trickle. One or two quiet calls from former colleagues who knew better than to put too much in writing. I had been out of Ridgewell for just over a month when I heard from Natalie Brooks, a sharp and steady analyst who had worked under me for 3 years. Why, she had always been cautious, the type who triple-checked her numbers before sending anything upstairs. Her voice was low, almost conspiratorial. When she spoke, "Dana, I think Tyler is skipping steps," she said. "The old protocols. The ones you drilled into us. They are just gone." I asked her to explain, and she told me about a deal that had been rushed through without the standard multi-level compliance review. "He says if it is not in the system, it does not need checking," she added, the frustration clear in her voice. "But the system only goes back so far, and you know it does not have the full history on half our legacy accounts." She paused. I thought about telling him, but he is not exactly open to feedback. I could hear the hesitation in her words, the careful choice to stay neutral in her tone. Tyler had already made it clear that dissent was unwelcome. Over the next few weeks, I heard similar stories from others. A junior associate named Kyle mentioned that several foreign contracts were being processed without the usual cross-department checks. Another colleague, Andrea, confided that Tyler had cut the compliance review time for high-value deals from 3 weeks to 5 days, calling it agility. She told me in a hushed voice, "It feels like we are walking on ice, and no one is looking down to see how thin it is." I listened without offering advice. It was not my place anymore, and truthfully, I knew that any warning from me would be seen as bitterness from someone no longer at the table. But each story lodged itself in the back of my mind, a growing collection of red flags waving silently in the distance. Tyler was building a machine that could run fast, but he had stripped away the parts that kept it from running straight into a wall. One afternoon, I stopped by the cafe near the Ridgewell building for a coffee. I spotted Natalie sitting alone by the window, her posture tense as she stared at her phone. She glanced up and saw me, giving a small smile before motioning me over. We talked about nothing at first. The weather, her new apartment, the awful traffic. Then her tone shifted. "Dana, I have to tell you something, but you did not hear it from me," she began. She leaned in, lowering her voice. "Tyler just signed off on an overseas transfer deal without any legacy compliance review. None. He told us the client's file was complete in the cloud system, so there was no need. But I remember you had flagged them once. I just do not know why." I sipped my coffee slowly, hiding my reaction. I knew exactly which client she meant, and I also knew the only record of my warning about them was sitting in that red binder, buried deep in the archives. Without it, Tyler had no idea what was coming. I thanked her for telling me, but I did not press her for details. The less she knew about my own quiet precautions, the better. As I walked back to my car, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Resentment, yes, but also a kind of grim patience. Tyler had been so eager to erase the past that he had blinded himself to its lessons. And now, the whispers in the halls were telling me exactly what I had suspected all along. The cracks were forming. It was only a matter of time before the break came, and when it did, the missing piece would be waiting, untouched, in the shadows where I had left it. Ambition has a sound. It is not loud at first. More like the low hum of something building, a frequency that makes you uneasy before you even know why. That is how Tyler's big play began. From what I was hearing, he had found his perfect opportunity to prove that his streamlined system was faster, cleaner, and more profitable than anything Ridgewell had ever done before. As the deal was with a massive overseas conglomerate called Althera Group, a name I knew too well. On paper, They looked like a jewel of a client. Deep pockets, global reach, a perfect match for the kind of high-profile transaction Tyler wanted to put his name on. In reality, they were the kind of client that could bleed you dry if you missed a single detail. I had dealt with Althara back in 2007, when their home currency was experiencing wild fluctuations, buried deep in their contract. So deep you would only find it if you were looking. Was a volatility clause that could trigger massive penalties during any period of financial instability. I documented it meticulously, page after page of notes explaining exactly how to navigate around it. That warning lived only in one place now, my red binder in the archives, hidden behind years of neglected files. Without it, the clause was invisible to anyone relying solely on the sanitized cloud system Tyler had built. From the way Natalie described it, Tyler treated the deal like a personal coronation. He called meetings not to gather input, but to announce his decisions. He spoke in absolutes. No delays, no unnecessary reviews. Speed equals profit. He refused to allocate time for the legacy compliance check, telling his team, if the file is clean in the system, it is clean, period. I could almost hear the smug certainty in his voice, the same tone he had, used when he called my binders Stone Age artifacts. The irony was almost too perfect. And the very clause he was ignoring had been the reason Ridgewell once narrowly avoided a multi-million-dollar disaster. But to Tyler, history was irrelevant unless it could be pulled up with a keyword search. Ray, he was blinded by the glow of his own ambition, too focused on the headlines he thought he would earn when the deal closed. Natalie called me one evening, her voice tight. "Dana, it is moving so fast I can barely keep up. He has cut the review process to 5 days. Here we are talking about hundreds of pages of contracts, cross-border regulations, tax implications, things we normally take weeks to comb through. And he just signed off. No second review, no outside counsel." I could hear the frustration in her tone, but also the resignation. And she knew her objections would be brushed aside. I listened, keeping my own counsel. There was nothing I could say that would change what was already in motion. Tyler had built his machine, and now he was running it at full speed straight toward the cliff. I could not stop him. I would not stop him. Because I knew something he did not. That the past has a way of cashing its debts, and it rarely accepts excuses as payment. When I hung up the phone that night, I sat for a long time in the quiet of my apartment, the city light spilling in through the window. Somewhere in the sub-basement of Ridgewell Capital Partners, my red binder waited. All it would take was one wrong turn for them to realize what they had thrown away. And from the sound of it, that turn was already dead ahead. It happened faster than even I expected. 3 months after Tyler's triumphant handshake photos with the executives from Althara Group, the financial news channels began flashing with headlines about a sudden drop in Althara's home currency. The kind of drop that sends markets spiraling and lawyers scrambling. I was making breakfast when I saw the ticker crawl across the bottom of the screen, and I froze with the coffee pot in my hand. I knew the currency crash was not just bad. It was the exact scenario that triggered the volatility clause buried in their contract. The clause Tyler had never seen. The clause I had documented in detail 14 years ago. By the end of that week, Ridgewell was in freefall. When the penalty clause kicked in automatically, halting payments and locking up hundreds of millions in expected revenue, subsidiaries pulled out of pending commitments, citing breach of terms. Board members were in emergency meetings around the clock, and staff were whispering in the hallways about a missing piece of the compliance review. Why, I heard later that Natalie described the office as a hospital waiting room where everyone already knows the prognosis is bad. And it was not just Althara. Meant two other legacy clients, both of whom had similarly delicate clauses, began pulling the same triggers. Tyler had streamlined their contracts without consulting the historical files, which meant those clauses had gone untouched and unprepared for. Payments stopped. Projects froze. The losses mounted until the final figure hit the boardroom like a hammer. $38 million gone in under 6 weeks. The panic was not contained to the upper floors. Junior analysts were being grilled in closed-door meetings. Middle managers were frantically combing through whatever was left of the shredded archives, looking for answers. And in every conversation, one question kept surfacing. Who knew about these clauses? And where were the original records? Tyler, by all accounts, was still trying to spin the situation as unforeseen market instability, but even he must have realized that excuse was wearing thin. The older staff remembered there had been warnings in the past, warnings that were no longer in the system. Somewhere, they said, the truth was written down. The problem was, no one knew where. I went about my life in quiet detachment, but inside, I could feel the inevitable pull of the moment I had been waiting for. That red binder, hidden behind boxes of training manuals in the sub-basement, held the answers to every question now circling like vultures above Ridgewell's glass towers. Tyler could not fix this with a dashboard update or a PR statement. This was not a glitch. This was the past cashing in a debt. I did not have to lift a finger. The dominoes had already started to fall, and each one carried the weight of his own decisions. And the one thing about dominoes is this: they never stop halfway through the run. They keep toppling until there is nothing left standing. Once the search began like a rumor. Soft, almost tentative, and then grew into a full-scale scramble. Ridgewell's executive floor was buzzing with a single objective: find the original compliance records for Althara Group and the other 2 legacy clients before the board demanded blood. I heard later that the CEO, Robert Hale, had slammed his hand on the table during one of those emergency meetings and said, "Someone, somewhere, has the original notes. Get them." The problem was that somewhere no longer existed in the way it used to. The archives had been gutted. Whole sections were gone, their contents scanned incompletely and then destroyed. Now in the cloud files were pristine in appearance but stripped of the layers that had once protected the company. It was like looking at a perfectly built house with no foundation. On for days, the records team combed through what little remained. That is when Ruby Chen, a new hire barely 3 months into her role, mentioned something odd. During the inventory months earlier, she had come across a binder unlike the others. Red, thick, and marked in bold letters. Legacy clients, do not purge. Wow, she remembered hesitating to log it because the label seemed ominous. And then she admitted she had left it on a shelf in the farthest corner of the archives, thinking someone more senior would decide what to do with it. The moment she described it, Robert knew it was important. "Show me," he told her, his voice cutting through the noise in the room. They went down together, the CEO in his tailored suit and Ruby in her simple flats, into the cool, dim air of the sub-basement. Past the neat rows of recently scanned files. Past the hollow gaps where shelves had been cleared. Finally, into the shadowed corner where boxes of outdated training manuals leaned in uneven stacks. And there it was. On the red binder. Dust clung to its cover, but the letters were still clear. Robert pulled it out with both hands, heavier than he expected, and flipped it open. The pages were dense with annotations, sticky notes, cross-references, and handwritten warnings in dark blue ink. Althera's contract was there, its volatility clause highlighted and underlined with 3 separate notes about its danger. The other 2 clients were there too, with timelines and contingency plans attached. Every missing detail was in that binder. Every safeguard Tyler had erased. Back upstairs, Robert spread it across the conference table, and the room went silent. The truth was undeniable. These were not Stone Age artifacts. This was the map that could have prevented $38 million in losses. And every page was signed by me. Tyler was called in within the hour. I am told the meeting was short. There was no shouting, no dramatic argument. Just a dismissal, swift and final. Security escorted him out, and by the end of the day, his name was already gone from the company directory. The golden boy had fallen, and the binder had done the talking for me. The phone rang early the next morning. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me knew to pick up. "Dana," Robert Hale's voice came through, firm but with an edge I had never heard from him before. "We found your binder." There was a pause, the kind of pause that carries weight. "And it saved us from losing everything." Unfortunately, it also came too late to save $38 million. I leaned back in my chair, letting the words settle. I could picture him now, sitting at the head of that long walnut conference table, the red binder open in front of him like a confession. The irony was sharp. Months ago, Tyler had dismissed my work as obsolete, and now Robert was speaking about it as if it were a lifeline. I did not gloat, but I will admit there was a small, quiet satisfaction in knowing the truth had come to the surface all on its own. "I want you to come back," Robert continued, his voice steady but urgent. "Name your terms." There was no pitch, no persuasion. Just a direct offer. I could tell this was not about sentiment. It was survival. Ridgewell had learned, the hard way, what happens when you strip away the parts of a system you do not understand. And now they needed the person who had built those parts to put the pieces back together. I did not rush to answer. Instead, I thought about those years in the glass-walled offices, the quiet hours spent untangling the knots others had tied, the way people like Tyler had looked at me as if I were a relic. If I returned, it would be on my terms, and my terms alone. "Full autonomy," I said finally. "No direct reports. I will advise, but I will not manage. Why, and I get the authority to rebuild compliance my way." I could almost hear him nodding through the phone. "Done," he said. "Start Monday." "I will start when I am ready," I replied, keeping my tone even. "And when I do, I will need access to every record you have left." Another pause, then a quiet, understood. When the call ended, I sat in the stillness of my apartment, the binder fresh in my mind. I had not asked for this situation, but I had prepared for it. My so-called Stone Age artifact had spoken louder than I ever could. It had not just exposed the cracks. It had shown the map to repair them. And in the process, it had reminded everyone at Ridgewell that progress without memory is not progress at all. It is just a prettier way to fail. Walking back into Ridgewell on that first morning felt like stepping into a room where the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. People turned their heads as I passed, some offering tight smiles, others avoiding my eyes entirely. The glass walls that once made me feel exposed now felt like a kind of stage, and I knew exactly what role I was here to play. Not the dutiful compliance officer I had been for nearly 2 decades, but the person you call when you have burned down the house and need someone who knows how to rebuild it, without pretending the fire never happened. Robert met me in the lobby himself, a small but deliberate gesture. "Dana," he said, shaking my hand with both of his. "Welcome back." His expression was a mixture of relief and something like contrition. As we walked toward the elevators, I could feel the weight of the silence in the building. Tyler's absence was like a missing tile in the floor. You might not trip over it, but you noticed it with every step. When we reached my new office, larger than my old one, though still lined with the familiar shelves, Robert closed the door. "Eyes here, we are starting fresh," he said, "but I want you to know that the board now understands what you were trying to preserve. Oh, we have a lot to fix." I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. He was not looking for speeches. He was looking for results. I unpacked slowly, placing my small framed photo of my parents back on the desk, setting my notebooks in a neat stack. The red binder sat beside them, a silent reminder of why I was here. I ran my fingers over its cover, feeling the weight of every warning, every note, every safeguard it contained. I thought about Tyler, about his sneakers and his slogans and his belief that nothing before his arrival mattered. I wondered if he had replayed the moment they asked him for those records, the moment he realized he did not have them, the moment he understood they were in my handwriting all along. Robert had given me full autonomy, and I intended to use it. My first order of business was not flashy. It was methodical. I began mapping out a hybrid system, one that blended the efficiency of digital processes with the depth of legacy records. The same analysts who had once been told my work was outdated now came to me with questions, their tone careful, almost respectful. They had seen what happens when speed is mistaken for strength. By the end of that week, I could feel the shift in the building. It was subtle, but it was there. People moved with a little more caution, asked a few more questions before signing off on deals. And every time someone glanced at the binder on my desk, I could see it in their eyes. They knew why it mattered. They knew why I mattered. By the end of my first quarter back, Ridgewell was no longer running on adrenaline and blind optimism. The pace had steadied, the panic had ebbed, and in its place was something more solid. Caution paired with clarity. I had rebuilt the compliance framework from the inside out, blending streamlined digital tools with preserved physical records, each annotated and cross-referenced so nothing could disappear into the ether again. Every new deal, no matter how glamorous or urgent, now passed through a checkpoint that included legacy data review. It was no longer optional. It was the law of the floor. Robert made good on his promise to give me full autonomy. I had no direct reports, no endless managerial meetings, no politicking for resources. My work was surgical. Review, refine, safeguard. The analysts quickly learned that if I flagged something, it was not to slow them down, but to save them from the kind of collapse they had just lived through. Even the younger hires, the ones who had been most enamored with Tyler's speed at all costs vision, began stopping by my office for advice. They would glance at the red binder sitting on the corner of my desk like it was some kind of relic, but I noticed they never laughed at it. Not anymore. Robert liked to say we had paid expensive tuition for forgetting the value of experience. He said it in board meetings, in investor calls, and once, to my face with a rueful smile. "We will not make that mistake twice," he told me, his hand resting briefly on the binder before he left my office. And I believed him. Not because he had changed into someone who valued the past out of sentiment, but because the numbers spoke for themselves. Since implementing the hybrid system, there had been 0 compliance breaches and not a single penalty. As for Tyler, the last I heard, he was consulting for small startups that were too young to know what they did not know. Maybe one day he would learn that innovation without memory is like building on sand. It looks solid until the first wave hits. Maybe he would remember the binder, and maybe he would not. Either way, it no longer mattered to me. I never set out to get revenge. I did not need to humiliate him or force some public reckoning. All I did was let the truth surface when it was ready, and the truth did the rest. In the end, my so-called Stone Age artifact outlasted the man who mocked it. And that, to me, was the quietest and most satisfying kind of justice there is. The kind that does not need an audience, only time.